Hello there and welcome. Whatever your reason for choosing this conversation today, I'm so glad that you did, and I really hope that you can find meaning in this episode. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication creates our social worlds. And by that, I mean that we have the power to change our social worlds, our contexts, our situations, our relationships by how we're choosing to communicate. And a big part of that is just vocabulary. Because if we don't have the language to describe what we're experiencing, then we don't describe what we're experiencing. Nobody talks about it. And the result of that is that we go on about our lives thinking we're all alone. So yes, the things we experience are important, but also our ability to communicate about those things is so important too. Today, I'm so happy to say that our conversation partners are Dr. Chris Wells and Emma Nicholson of the Positive Disintegration podcast. Chris Wells is a writer, social worker, and founder of the Dabrowski Center, which is a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the theory of positive disintegration. And Emma creates content for people learning about the theory of positive disintegration on her website and on her YouTube channel. Together, they are the co-hosts of the Positive Disintegration podcast, which is all about Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. This theory is like CMM, it's pretty layered with lots of components, so I won't try to break it all down for you right here. Emma and Chris will give us an overview of the theory in this episode, and I also suggest that you go check out their podcast if you want a deeper understanding. I think that everything that we already talk about around our coordinated management of meaning theory goes hand in hand so easily with the theory of positive disintegration. So we're going to hear some meaningful stories today, make some good connections, and hopefully spark some new ideas. So let's jump right in. Hi, Emma and Chris. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Good. I'm glad to have you. I'm happy to just jump right in if you are ready to go into it and just start by introducing yourselves, keeping in mind that the context of the podcast is stories. I wonder if either of you have some stories to share that might help us have a better understanding of who both of you are going into this conversation.
Well, thanks so much for having us, Abbie. Yeah, I think that stories are really the best way to help make sense of the theory that we work with. I am a writer first. I feel like when I was thinking about how to introduce myself, I thought, well, I'm a writer. My educational background is in sociology, social work, and psychology. And I study this theory of positive disintegration. And when I try to help people understand what it means, I talk with them about the fact that I grew up kind of knowing that I was an extreme outlier. I was identified as a gifted kid, but there was never any discussion of what that meant. And I took my difference to mean that there was something wrong with me. And so I ended up going kind of in and out of the mental health system in my 20s. Positive disintegration in my life has been very real, and mostly made sense of it through like the lens of pathology until I had positive disintegration as a different framework to understand myself. So I'm not sure if that was a decent introduction or not. I don't know if I should go on and on with it, but I certainly could.
It's a great start. I think that's a good place. We can jump to Emma and then get into more of it as, the rest of our conversation unfolds. I'm sure we'll hear more stories.
It's weird because I tend to say everything in stories anyway. So
perfect.
This is probably perfect for this podcast.
Yep.
Like Chris, I grew up gifted, but really outside of the school context, it didn't mean a whole lot. And particularly in my young adulthood, I struggled a whole lot. A couple of years ago, I had what I'd call the dark night of the soul. So I had a very big disintegration and I didn't know what was happening to me. So I went to the internet looking for answers. And I think I Googled something like, why is my brain breaking? And accidentally stumbled across the theory of positive disintegration. And I had kind of a moment like the ugly duckling seeing itself in the water for the first time and realizing it was a swan. When I read about overexcitabilities, when I read about the process of disintegration, suddenly my life sort of made sense. But in my hunt for resources after that to make more sense of the theory, I found that there wasn't a lot of easily accessible information out there. And what was sort of aimed at parents of gifted children, which didn't apply to me in my 40s, so a little too late. So I wanted to do my part to make this theory a bit more accessible. So my background is a business analyst, and I work in project management, and a lot of my bread and butter has been taking technical info and simplifying it. I started doing YouTube videos and just putting my stuff out there on the internet for all to see. And eventually I met Chris, and we both had this shared passion for making the theory accessible. So that's how we ended up doing the Positive Disintegration podcast together. From my perspective, I don't have the wealth of knowledge that Chris does. So all I really have to offer people is my stories and tell them about what I've been through, and hopefully that will resonate with them in some way.
Absolutely. And I know you phrase it as, all I have are just my little stories, but that's really the most powerful thing in my mind. And I see similarities in myself of kind of coming to some of the communication theories that I've gotten to interact with, in that it's comforting. It feels like community when you get that language to be able to put into words something you've already known to be true in yourself, but you just didn't have the language to say it. And then on top of that, to understand that you're not the only person that experiences that. I think it's helpful around the making meaning, which is where I want to enter into our conversation with this making meaning point, because you both use the same wording to say, Chris said, I was told I was gifted, but nobody said what that meant, or I didn't know what these things meant. And so I wonder if you could first start talking about what is giftedness and what did it mean to both of you?
Well, what is giftedness is such a tough question, because you can be gifted in multiple domains.
Okay.
There's no consensus definition for it. But for this podcast, I think that we should think of it as intelligence. That's how I'm going to talk about it. That was my experience of it. Growing up, being tested, learning that I had a very high IQ. Of course, giftedness is broader than IQ. You can't only think of it from that lens. But that was the lens that I was given when I was young. Some people, it's achievement. It's what they do in the classroom, which is not necessarily the same thing. You can be a high achiever and not have this like psychological giftedness of having very high intelligence. And then there are other domains. I'm not a musician. I'm not like an artist. You can be gifted in those areas. And so there's so many ways that giftedness can look. But when I was a kid, it felt very much tied to achievement, even though I wasn't a high achiever, and so the fact that I didn't perform in the classroom made me feel even more like there was something wrong with me.
Emma, what does giftedness mean to you?
I guess when I was younger, it did mean that achievement scope. So, I got through school quite easily, with the academic sort of lens. But in life, I didn't seem to cope with things so well. And there was always this, why can't you deal with things? You're smart. Why can't you figure this out? And I think when Chris is talking about giftedness being beyond intelligence, we're sort of starting to understand that when someone's an outlier to that extent, it is really a sort of difference in their neurotype and you experience the world differently. But I always had some awareness of that I was experiencing life differently to other people. I thought I was just odd. I didn't realize that there were other people out there having the same experience or, the same difference in experience that I was. And not understanding that really, puts an anchor in the water for you when you're trying to sail through life. Finding out about it later sort of frees you from some of that stuff. And it's that connection of realizing I am not alone in this. Part of that whole ugly duckling moment of figuring out what's happening to you is also understanding that you're not just this weird little oddball sitting by yourself in a corner of the world. You're having this different experience of the world and, suffering and struggling alone. There are actually other people out there who are like you and who can identify with that. I think part of the powerful thing of the podcast is every time we get on there and share our stories and our guests come on and share their stories, we then get feedback and emails of people saying, this is what I needed. I needed to understand that I wasn't alone.
Yeah. I think that's so important. And that's why in like CMM, we talk about we're co-creators and we talk about collaboration. And so, yeah, sharing those stories is, I think, an invaluable part of that. Emma, I know that part of the language that was important to your self-discovery in this was around overexcitability. Can you explain that? Teach us what that is?
You're asking the non-academic one to explain what overexcitability is. Oof.
No, see, this is what we need, because it shouldn't just, that language, I think, should be able to be, everyone should be able to understand what that means, you know, not, it shouldn't just exist in the world of academia if it can be helpful to people like you, right?
Okay, here's a challenge round. All right. So my understanding of it, and I'm happy for Chris to correct me if I stray off the path a little bit, is that overexcitability is a neurotype, I guess, where a person is particularly sensitive and responsive to stimuli, and that's both internal and external. So everything in the world around you is very rich and detailed and loud, and everything going on in your head is also quite rich and detailed and loud. And there's 5 areas where that covers. So the first one is psychomotor, so having a lot of energy and a need for action and a need for movement. You have sensual, which is pertaining to the 5 senses. So what you're receiving from the world is very, very rich and intense. Then you've got intellectual, which is that not just intellectual capability, but that thirst for feeding your mind, to want to question things, to want to think about things, to want to analyze things and ask a lot of questions. Then you have imaginational, so a very strong imagination, being drawn to imaginative pursuits, running away with daydreams and things like that. Well, that's what it means for me. And the last one is emotional, which is quite important because it means having quite intense, complex emotions occurring. And we had a guest on our podcast that sort of described it as some people have the standard box of crayons with 8 or 10 colours in it. Maybe they colour with one crayon at once.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have the big fat 64 colour with the sharpener in it, and sometimes you're picking up a handful of crayons and like doodling away with 8 at the same time. So I guess it's that intensity of experience, and that difference in experiencing the world is a qualitative difference. You are basically having a different life, a different experience of what reality is.
I know I'm maybe putting you on the spot here asking this, but do you have, as you've, done self-reflection and consider the theory for positive disintegration in your life, do you have a kind of example of how that overexcitability showed up in your life?
Unfortunately, I've got tons of them. So I cover across all 5 overexcitabilities, and whether you're talking about the inability to sit still, being easily bored in class, continually daydreaming, which is something I do even to this day. I'm very easily distracted by my imagination. I've always got to question things. I always overanalyze stuff. I read between the lines even when there's nothing there. And I have these great big whopping complex, powerful emotions that hit me like a freight train every now and then. And at many points through my life, I thought that was just me not coping with life. And it turns out that my emotions and experiences were valid. And yes, they were powerful and complicated, but that was okay.
Chris, do you have anything to add about overexcitability from an academic perspective?
Well, I wouldn't even do it really from the academic perspective. Well, maybe a little. Like the only thing I would add really is to say that overexcitability is a really old term. You can find it, in like the 18th and 19th century in writing. Well, maybe not the 18th, but
not recent though.
It's old. When I was doing my deep dive, I found it in William James's Principles of Psychology from 1890. It was also known as nervousness. And but Emma did a beautiful job. It's so much better that she asked you to describe it, Emma, than me, because I would have given like a definition, so that was perfect. And then though, the thing that I would add about how it shows up in my life is from the emotional perspective. And that is that I really value relationships. Relationships are like the most important thing in connection. And when we talk about emotional overexcitability, it's like a strong attachment, to other people, to places, to things, to pets, and so that relationship connection is really important. And I was also thinking, I want to throw this in before we go far away from it, and I don't have a chance to say it, but giftedness, we need to co-create that story and that meaning. And that's what we're missing. And those of us who work in this field and work with it, It's that, you know, there's been all of these academic arguments for decades and this recycling of issues. But what we really need to do now in the 21st century, from my perspective, is to come together to see where the meaning is, to create this story together of what giftedness is, where it's going, where it shows up in our lives, and what meaning we can make from it. That's the part that seems to me to be missing.
Yeah.
From the field anyway.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And it's making me think. I had a conversation earlier this year with a woman named Stephanie Higgs, and she's a gifted educator. And so she talked about giftedness in schools. But like you said, that's only one part of the story of giftedness. But I think what was important about our conversation is that something that I see through the lens of CMM is talking about she would come up with individualized learning plans for her gifted kids. And I think maybe that's part of this conversation that you're saying needs to be happening, is that the question is not, okay, how do we fix these people with overexcitability, with giftedness that are experiencing the world differently, and do something so that they can just accept the stimuli of the world, but how do we adapt the social world to the way that people experience it, recognizing that not every person experiences the social world in the same way. So how can we make the social world do the changing on the outside rather than the inside, I guess? And I wonder if that resonates with you both, because you've talked about those labels being maybe a burden or something that made you feel like you were the problem, the ugly duckling, or, you know, whatever Emma was calling it.
I think that part of the problem is that we've been dealing in stereotypes for so long of what giftedness is, because we talk on our podcast a bit about the overlap between giftedness and other neurotypes when it comes to overexcitability. So we know that people that are autistic or ADHDers, they also experience overexcitability, but there's been very little understanding of that and research done, and even stories collected and and examined. And this is really, I think, the next step of what needs to happen. But as long as we have stereotypes of what it means to be any of these things, we're not getting to the heart of the matter with any of them. And it's really unfortunate. And it's held us back for far too long, in my opinion.
Anything you want to add, Emma?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about stereotypes, there's always two sides to every coin. And I think the problem with the term giftedness is it implies a gift. And as the saying goes, if this is a gift, can I give it back? People say it in terms of advantage, but there's also disadvantage. And side note to Chris, I think this will segue down into dynamisms just quietly. So there's good things about it and there's bad things about it. Like with overexcitabilities, there's, you know, if you have a rich imagination, yeah, okay, it can lead to creativity, but it can also be quite distracting. And when you're talking about gifted kids needing plans, I kind of, when I was at school, there was no sort of accommodation for that. And I remember very clearly being in kindergarten and being held back one day by my teacher. I was in a composite class with kinder, first and second, so I had a lot of older kids in my class. And I was a troublemaker. I was not doing my work. I was up. I was talking to everybody else. And when I talked to my dad about this experience of me being held back, my parents being called in, he said, well, basically, you were bored. You're bored out of your brain. You were doing stuff that, you know, was just too basic for you. And that's why you were over nosing with the bigger kids to see what they were doing, because it was more interesting. And when, you know, the teacher said, well, I don't want to bump her up a couple of years because it'll hurt her, you know, social development. My dad just went, well, if you're going to bore the brains out of her, then her behavior is your problem.
Yeah.
You know, so he was always like, I was very concerned school wouldn't keep up with you. And if we don't recognize that, you know, kids are experiencing the world differently and have different needs.
Yeah.
And we're not meeting those needs. We're just going, here is the standard round peg, round hole curriculum.
Yeah.
Then we're not doing it. And then that carries into your adult life as well. That carries into workplaces and, you know, our relationships and interactions. When Chris talked about forming really strong emotional attachments, that has been fantastic in my life, but has also been horrendous and led me to situations where maybe I should have left, but I was far too attached to a person. And so there's a good and bad side to everything. And when it comes to the theory of positive disintegration, and probably Chris can talk a little bit more about this, there's these dynamisms or feelings that help kind of shape your behavior. Some of them aren't so great. Things like guilt and shame and dissatisfaction with yourself. And when you're wired to feel everything more intensely, you're going to feel those bad feelings like more intensely as well. It's not just the good things, it's also the bad stuff.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing when you talked about the 5 different kinds of overexcitability is that, being in touch with your emotions, being in touch with your senses, being in touch with your imagination, all have the capacity to be positive things and the capacity to overwhelm everything else and make the experience a negative one, or, whatever language you would put to that. And so maybe it's about balance. I think what it's drawing a connection to in my brain for me is that I've always been someone that was driven by stress and anxiety. And only recently have I been able to distinguish, okay, stress up to this point is healthy and productive, actually. But there's a point beyond that where the worry about what's going to happen, the worry about the things I can't control, it doesn't serve me. And so letting that go. And so I wonder if there's some of that in the theory for positive disintegration of finding this balance, or I wonder what language you use around that. Is it regulation? Is that the core of disintegration?
Well, first, you made me think of something that is kind of important, I think, to add about the overexcitabilities, just briefly, is that if you remove emotional and think about the other 4, they're all not only ways of experiencing the world, but also of processing emotional tension. And so tension is a really important thing in this theory. And so having these overexcitabilities produces inner conflict and external conflict. And so Dabrowski said that the dynamisms come from the overexcitabilities. They are producing, especially the ones that Emma talked about, are clearly like emotionally charged guilt and shame, dissatisfaction with yourself, because the tension aspect of overexcitability is something that I think gets lost sometimes for people. Like when you think about them as just characteristics or traits in somebody, then you may miss the fact that they're producing this conflict inside of yourself. Like inner conflict is a really significant aspect of the theory. So I wouldn't say that Dabrowski really talked about balance or coming to some kind of homeostasis. And yet he did talk about transforming overexcitabilities. He absolutely believed that through your own autopsychotherapy and self-education, you can learn how to live with this intense experience of reality and let it guide you well, which is what the dynamisms do. And another thing that, I was like wanting to just mention briefly is I've heard them called like spurs to self-correction. That's what Michael Bihovsky, one of the scholars of this theory, talks about. And I kind of love that phrase, spurs to self-correction, because that's exactly what we need in order to live well in the social environment, to be good citizens, to be good people. We need to be able to recognize and self-reflect and know that our behavior has caused somebody else anguish too, maybe, and we need to do better. And so that's really one of the essential aspects of the dynamisms, is that they help us to do better, to make better choices, to improve ourselves and do that work of inner transformation. That's another thing that gets lost often in the conversation about this theory, is that positive disintegration, it's work. Like it's work to transform yourself. It doesn't happen easily. It's tough.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think coming back to the basics of positive disintegration, what we're talking about is rebuilding values. And if you think about values, values are our principles of how we behave. There are standards of behavior. What is important to us drives our behavior. And that's all about how we interact with other people. But as Chris said, it's those spurs of correction. So it's like carrots and sticks emotionally to correct you to well, what is really in alignment with your values and what is not in alignment with your values? And we hit a point sometimes in life, it's, for some people it's very early on, even in childhood, and some people it's later, where we start to question our values. And the reason why the theory is called positive disintegration is that, you get values from the day dot, from when you're a kid, from your parents, from school, from religion, from wherever you're told what is right and wrong. At some point, if you start to question that, first of all, it's like a big Lego brick house or something. You've got to pull all those pieces together in order to do that self-examination and that work, and then figure out, well, what actually do I feel are my values? What is true to me authentically? And then rebuild from there. And those dynamisms of, things like guilt and shame of how you behaved, those feelings are like those spurs, those carrots and sticks that say, no, that was not cool. What you did then, how you behaved with that person, not good. And it's basically your continual self-correction. But the thing is, like, when you get spurred, you think about a horse. If the horse doesn't turn in the direction, it's going to keep getting spurred, right? So if you keep ignoring that, it's going to get more and more intense.
Yeah.
And you will just keep getting those little stick pokes and those little spurs until you actually do something about it and start walking your talk.
Yeah, that's definitely a helpful way of understanding that in terms of the personal growth. Yeah, we've obviously already hit on a couple elements of the theory of positive disintegration. So I want to kind of maybe pause before we get too ahead of ourselves and ask you to provide, I know there's probably a succinct or maybe not academic definition of the theory. So I'd love to ask you maybe what that is and then how you both understand it as well. But I'll go ahead and preface to take some of the pressure off of you and tell my listeners to check out your podcast and your first episode that has, a great, more in-depth description of what the theory is than what we'll have time to get to today. So I know I said that my theory is complex. I know yours has a lot of layers as well. So don't feel like you have to hit on all of it. But I just wonder, after we've talked about, a couple different of the elements, how do they all relate to each other? How do they come together to form this theory? Chris, would you start us off with what the theory of positive disintegration is?
Sure. It's so hard to say in a nutshell, but there is one quote. So this quote is from a paper from 1983 from Lisi and Pahovsky. The main idea of Dabrowski's theory is this: it is emotional life that empowers and guides an individual toward a higher level, because it is passionate involvement that makes us capable of empathy, understanding, caring, and finding a goal beyond self that gives our lives meaning and direction.
Yeah.
I just haven't found any other brief nutshell definition that captures it that well. I mean, because part of what made it so hard for Dabrowski to get his theory accepted in his own life was the way that he valued emotions so much at a time when they were seen as not important or not valued, where cognition was king. And,
right.
Emotion was like something to be denied or repressed and certainly not celebrated. But to him, emotional life was the most important thing, and it guided this inner transformation. And so that's such an important part of this.
And when you think about that, we're now starting to understand that, you can rationalize and intellectualize things all you like, but if you don't believe it, if you don't feel it in your heart, then it doesn't really become true for you.
Right.
And I think that's something that he understood is you can think about being empathetic towards people all you like, but if you don't feel it in your heart, it's not real. I get where Chris is coming from that time of, cognition is king, because that hangover still sticks around in society today. And you see it even in our media. So, Spock in Star Trek prizes logic about, he can't let his human emotional side out. And we still got this thing, this Jekyll Hyde kind of, concept around the use and the value of emotions. And we keep talking about, regulating your emotions and calming yourself. And, but in some way, if you don't feel those emotions, you don't feel those spurs, for self-correction.
Yeah.
And I think that's what was magic about that particular theory, was that here's someone who was recognizing, like Chris has summed up much better than I have, but that without emotion, like you're never going to feel that belief, and then your behavior is not going to be authentic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to look at that context and say that we even still have some of those leftover ideas that prizes logic above emotion, but there's so much that our emotions could teach us. I guess the way I would put it is we haven't been taught the language of our emotions. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Brene Brown, but I know she's written a book and talked about that, doing studies and saying on average, people can name about 3 emotions in themselves when really there's hundreds. You know, learning some of that vocabulary can be so freeing, can open doors to us. And like you're saying, the way you frame it in your theory is that's what opens us up to then be able to do some of that self-work. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like just personally in my story, when I was young, I was so disconnected from my emotions. I mean, even though I felt intensely, I didn't have people modeling emotional maturity in my life. You know, I happened to have been born to parents who were teenagers, and I ended up growing up not being connected with my emotions, not knowing how to manage them, not knowing how to talk about them. It was a real problem. I remember later when I was in my 20s, and one of the times when I was hospitalized, they were like, you have to get in touch with your emotions. You have to be able to name them and understand them. And I was just like it just felt ridiculous that it was so difficult to do that. But it was a whole long process of getting it and being able to feel, to accept feelings, to not push them away when they were uncomfortable. These things, we should grow up learning about this stuff, but we don't. I mean, we just don't. Like, if we don't happen to be born in a family where this is discussed and dealt with, well, how rare is that? I mean, it doesn't take much to know that this is uncommon, and it's something that we need to work on, you know, as a society. Emotions matter and they're important. And if we could learn how to gain some kind of emotional maturity when we were young, we could save ourselves so much heartache.
I think it like social emotional learning should be taught in schools the same way like math and science are classes. I think it's kind of ridiculous to assume that children will just pick it up along the way. And that's part of when you take a communication perspective in the world, we think about communication as this abstract force that we just take for granted that we all just know how to do well. But if you're not thinking about it, if you're not being intentional, if you're not doing that self-reflection, then I don't know how anyone thinks they could find that effective communication. They might be communicating, but are they doing it in a way that's effective, that's intentional, that's productive, that leads to that creation of that better social world?
I think it goes beyond that, though, because sitting down and learning about emotions is still intellectualizing it.
That's true.
In my mind. Right? If you take, you know, kids in a classroom or people at work, right, in an office, sit down, behave, be quiet. Where is the scope for expressing those emotions? Apart from certain times when you're allowed to, say in music or in drama or in art, then you can selectively express your emotions. But the way society is built is around controlling emotional behaviors and reactions towards each other. You know, don't be angry. Don't jump up and down with excitement. Sit down, be quiet, behave. It goes deeper than just sort of learning about it on a personal level. Society is structured to control our emotional reactions in every possible way. You know, get up, go to work, you know, clock in, do the 9 to 5, go home, you know, don't get upset, don't yell. Everything in our life is around like these social guide rails that we have that are mitigating our behavior at every turn and our thoughts and you know, how we think about ourselves. And I think this comes back to the theory is when someone hasn't gone through that disintegration and thought about their own values, they're relying on those social guardrails to guide them to, you know, calm their you know, inner instincts and stuff. And I think, you know, we have to not only question our own values and guardrails internally, we've got to question the ones in broader society and say, are they helping? Are they serving? Or are they simply turning us into these robotic little, automatons that are going about our business and never allowed to let our emotions out?
I think that's a great point. And I think the way I see it is that it has to happen in 2 phases almost. Of that first phase is what I'm talking about, having something like a classroom maybe where you learn that language. And I love the language. And so I feel like I could just live there forever in that spot of learning the language and how that feels within myself to know different language about my emotions. That opens up new worlds inside myself for me. But then the step that has to happen beyond that, which is what I think you're trying to add, is that it can't just be in a classroom. Beyond that, what does it look like for it to act out? What does it look like in a practical sense in our lives? How does it actually manifest itself in how we're living? And I don't know what the answer is of, how we can integrate that better into children's lives so that we have young people that grow up into adults that have done this work and that have done that self-reflection to be able to then go out and, co-create with each other a better social world.
You just made me think, Abbie, that part of the problem is that what happens with children is that we invalidate them so easily, whether it's in the classroom or at home. And we say, no, don't feel that way. We tell them to shut down how they feel by telling them how to behave and what to do. Where what we need to do, I think, is let them feel, when you have 2 children who are upset with each other, let them feel upset, work it out and move through it. Don't shut them down, because shutting them down teaches them that it's not okay to feel. And that's just part of how this happens, I think. But it's a real problem that obviously, there's layers to it, at home, at school, in society. But if we valued children more than we do, then we would take this more seriously and we would end up with healthier adults.
Yeah, right. That's good.
We are going to pause our conversation with Emma and Chris here and pick back up with part 2 of this conversation next Monday. In the meantime, let this conversation stay with you, see what comes up, continue to reflect on it. Like any conversation we have in our lives, this one doesn't necessarily end right when we stop talking or right when you turn off the episode. These stories stay with us, so I hope you're able to keep some of them with you and come back next week for more. As always, I get to do this podcast with support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. They are working on so many great initiatives like this podcast, all in the hopes of creating a better social world. I don't know about you, but that is definitely a mission I can get behind. I'll add a link to their website in the notes where you can learn more about them and all of their initiatives, and I definitely encourage you to check them out. Finally, let's end with some next turns, what we can do after listening to this episode. So please follow the show wherever you listen, leave a review and a rating, share this episode with someone you want to invite into our ongoing conversation, and connect with me on Instagram at Stories Lived, Stories Told Pod, on YouTube at Stories Lived, Stories Told, or on the website at storieslived.storiestold.com. Thank you so much for taking the time to do one or all of these things, and thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. Until next time, I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.